The Kirlian Camera. The image emerges in the darkroom like a secret bleeding through the paper. It is a photograph of a human hand, but it does not look like flesh and bone. Instead, the fingertips are outlined by a brilliant, sparkling halo of electric blue and violet light. It looks like a localized lightning storm radiating from the skin. To those who first saw these images, it looked like something else entirely. It looked as though a machine had finally managed to photograph the human soul. This was the Kirlian Camera. The story begins in the Soviet Union in 1939. Semyon Kirlian, an electrician, and his wife Valentina, a journalist and teacher, were visiting a hospital in Krasnodar when they observed a patient undergoing treatment with a high-frequency electrical generator. When the electrodes were brought near the patient's skin, Kirlian noticed a tiny flash of neon-like light. Intrigued by the anomaly, he decided to try and capture that invisible flash on film. The machine they built to do this was remarkably simple, completely discarding the traditional camera lens. The anatomy of a Kirlian device consists of a flat metal plate connected to a high-voltage, high-frequency oscillator. A sheet of photographic film is placed directly on top of the metal plate. The subject, whether a human hand, a coin, or a freshly picked leaf, is placed directly onto the film in a dark room. When the electrical current is switched on, a high-voltage field surges through the object, and the resulting burst of light exposes the film. The documented science behind the machine is entirely real. Physicists know the phenomenon as corona discharge. The high-voltage field ionizes the air around the object, creating a luminous plasma that is captured by the photographic emulsion. But the story of the Kirlian camera did not stay within the boundaries of physics. As the Kirlians continued their experiments, they noticed that the glowing halos were not static. The rings of light shifted in size, color, and intensity from day to day. According to later claims, these fluctuations corresponded directly to the health, emotional state, and vitality of the living subject. When a person was tired or sick, the glow appeared dim, broken, and weak. When they were energized, the sparks flared brilliantly. For decades, mystics and alternative researchers claimed that the machine was not just measuring electricity, it was capturing the biological aura, the elusive life force of living things. The legend reached its absolute peak with a phenomenon known as the phantom leaf effect. In these experiments, researchers would take a living leaf, cut off the top third with a scalpel, and place the mutilated leaf onto the Kirlian plate. When the voltage surged and the film was developed, the photograph would allegedly show the glowing electrical outline of the entire leaf, including the severed portion. For believers, this was the Holy Grail. It was physical proof of the etheric body, a template of energy that survived even after physical trauma. The physical leaf was gone, but its energetic ghost remained inside the machine. But this is exactly where the mystery meets its boundary. The missing evidence in the Kirlian file is a reliable, independently verifiable phantom leaf produced under strict laboratory controls. Skeptics and scientists quickly pointed out that when a whole leaf is placed on a glass plate, it leaves behind microscopic traces of moisture, sap, and cellular residue. When the leaf is cut and placed back on the exact same glass, the high-voltage electricity illuminates that leftover moisture, creating a phantom out of biological sweat. When the experiment is conducted in a vacuum, or when the glass is meticulously sterilized between uses, the phantom leaf disappears. The documented reality is that moisture, pressure, and the natural conductivity of human skin are entirely sufficient to explain the shifting, brilliant auras. Yet, the Kirlian camera has never entirely lost its grip on the public imagination. The ordinary explanation clarifies the mechanism, but it does not diminish the visual power of the result. The machine survived the debunking because it produced exactly what we desperately wanted to see. It is a real machine capturing a real light. But what people saw in that light was a mirror of their own beliefs. a beautiful physical effect forever mistaken for magic. The 21-gram scale. Imagine a quiet room in Massachusetts in the spring of 1901. A man suffering from the final stages of tuberculosis lies on a canvas cot. But the bed is not resting on the floor. It is suspended in the air, anchored directly onto the heavy iron beams of a massive weighing mechanism. The doctor standing nearby is not there to administer medicine. He is there to watch the needle on the dial. This was the 21-gram scale, a machine built for a single morbid purpose: to weigh the human soul. The physician behind the experiment was Dr. Duncan MacDougall of Haverhill, Massachusetts. MacDougall reasoned that if the human soul existed, it must take up space, and if it took up space, it must have mass. To test this, he constructed a highly specialized apparatus. The anatomy of the device consisted of a lightweight wooden framework built upon a standard Fairbanks platform scale, the kind usually used for weighing bulk industrial goods. Atop this frame sat the cot. Despite its immense size, MacDougall calibrated the machine to be incredibly sensitive, capable of detecting a shift of just 0.2 of an ounce. Over the course of his study, MacDougall placed 6 terminally ill patients onto the bed. Sitting beside them for hours, he accounted for the natural, gradual loss of weight from sweat and the moisture in their breathing. But he was waiting for the exact moment of death. According to his meticulous ledgers, published in the journal American Medicine in 1907, the anomaly happened with his very first patient. At the precise moment the man's heart stopped, the beam of the scale dropped audibly, hitting the lower measuring bar. The sudden loss of mass was calculated at exactly 3/4 of an ounce, or 21.3 grams. To reinforce his theory, MacDougall later tested 15 dogs on the same apparatus, reporting that none of them showed a sudden drop in weight at death, aligning with the theological belief that only humans possessed a soul. The story immediately bled into public consciousness. The New York Times ran a headline declaring, "Soul has weight, physician thinks." The specific number, 21 grams, detached itself from the hospital ward and became a global legend. Later, unverified accounts even claimed a mysterious light or aura was seen hovering above the dying patients in the room, further cementing the myth. But when we look at the documented boundaries of the experiment, the physical evidence begins to fray. The missing piece of the puzzle is a reliable, consistent sample size. While the first patient lost exactly 21 grams, the data for the other 5 was chaotic. 2 patients lost weight at death, but then continued to lose more mass minutes later. One scale wasn't finely adjusted in time. Another patient's test was thrown out entirely due to interference by people moving in the room. MacDougall himself admitted his sample size was far too small to serve as definitive proof, and modern replication with precise digital scales remains entirely missing from the scientific record. The most ordinary explanation for the famous 21-gram drop points to biology, not theology. When the heart stops, the lungs no longer cool the blood. This causes a sudden, brief spike in body temperature, which leads to a rapid burst of sweating and moisture evaporation. Critics also suggest a sudden exhalation of air, or even thermal changes affecting the delicate metal mechanics of the scale itself. Yet more than a century later, the legend remains unshakable. It is the most famous number in the history of the paranormal, born from a machine that tried to force the spiritual world onto a physical ledger. The experiment may not have produced the flawless data MacDougall hoped for, but what it left behind was a profound historical shadow. The scale failed to definitively prove the soul exists, but it perfectly measured humanity's desperate, enduring desire to prove that we are more than just biology. The Spiricom. A messy workbench sits in a dimly lit room, cluttered with tangled wires, dials, and stacked oscillators. The room is filled with a synthetic, droning hum of overlapping electronic tones, a constant, irritating buzz that vibrates in the air. Suddenly, cutting through the static, A raspy, robotic voice begins to speak. It is not a random fragment of radio interference. It is a deliberate, conversational response to the man sitting in front of the machine. This was the Spiricom. Developed in the late 1970s by William O'Neill and George Meek, it was a complex piece of audio engineering designed for a single, impossible purpose: two-way, real-time communication with the dead. The machine was not a simple radio receiver waiting to catch stray frequencies. The anatomy of the Spiricom was intensely technical and intentionally chaotic. It consisted of a towering stack of 13 tone generators, oscillators, and radio transmitters wired together on a desk. The operating theory was that spirits lacked the physical vocal cords to make sound in our world. So the machine provided a multi-frequency carrier wave. By emitting a continuous, loud blend of specific tones, an invisible entity could allegedly manipulate the synthetic audio energy in the room, bending it into human words. The documented reality of the project is firmly established. The device physically existed. George Meek, a wealthy researcher and inventor, funded the project, while O'Neill, an electronics technician and self-proclaimed medium, built and operated the rig. They recorded hours of audio on cassette tapes and freely distributed them. Seeking scientific validation, they published the schematics, making the technical blueprints available to the public. On the surviving tapes, O'Neill can be heard having casual, extended conversations with a harsh, buzzing voice that responds to him by name. The central claim of the project was staggering. The voice on the tape allegedly belonged to Dr. George Mueller, a deceased NASA scientist. According to O'Neill, Dr. Mueller was not just a spirit visiting the machine. He was actively guiding its construction from the other side, helping O'Neill fine-tune the frequencies to improve the audio clarity. It created a strange, chilling paradox. A machine engineered by the very ghost it was trying to contact. But when we examine the evidence boundary, the Spiricom hits a massive wall. The missing proof is replication by independent researchers. Because the blueprints were public, other engineers and audio specialists built exact replicas of the Spiricom rig. They sourced the same oscillators. They powered on the 13-tone generators. They waited in the droning static. But no voices ever came through. The machine only seemed to work when William O'Neill was the one sitting in front of it. The most ordinary explanation points directly to O'Neill. Skeptics and audio experts noted that the robotic voice of Dr. Mueller sounded remarkably like the output of an electrolarynx, a medical device placed against the throat to artificially generate speech. It is strongly theorized that O'Neill faked the tapes using a mechanical voice box or ventriloquism, mixing his altered voice seamlessly with the droning noise of the tone generators. The most mysterious interpretation is that the machine actually worked, but it required O'Neill's specific psychic mediumship as a biological component. In this view, the hardware was merely an amplifier for a connection that already existed in his mind. The Spiricom wasn't just a recording device. It was an attempt to hardwire a telephone line to the afterlife. It survived in paranormal lore because the audio tapes are deeply, undeniably unsettling. Hearing them feels like listening to something strictly forbidden, and the sheer technical complexity of the machine gave it an aura of cold scientific credibility. Was it a breakthrough in spiritual engineering, or an elaborate electronic puppet show? The machine was real, the blueprints were public, yet the voices only ever spoke to one man, leaving us to wonder if the ghost was in the machine or in the man himself. The Orgone Accumulator. In the summer of 1956, federal agents oversaw the destruction of a series of wooden cabinets, but they did not stop with the machines. Acting on court orders, officials transported tons of scientific publications and journals to an incinerator in New York and burned them. It remains one of the most severe examples of state-sponsored censorship in modern American history. The target of this purge was a psychoanalyst named Wilhelm Reich, and the machines reduced to splintered wood were known as Orgone accumulators. Reich had spent the earlier part of his career as a respected student of Sigmund Freud, but by the 1940s, his research had taken a sharp turn into the experimental fringe. Operating out of a large rural estate in Maine called Orgone, Reich became convinced that he had discovered a universal atmospheric life force. He called it Orgone energy. To harness it, he designed a machine. The anatomy of the Orgone accumulator was deceptively simple. It looked somewhat like a claustrophobic telephone booth-sized cabinet. The walls were constructed using alternating layers of organic and inorganic materials, typically steel wool and fiberglass, encased in an outer layer of wood, with an inner lining of sheet metal. According to Reich's theory, the organic layers would absorb Orgone energy from the atmosphere, while the metallic layers would reflect it inward, trapping it in the center of the box. The documented history shows that Reich rented and sold these accumulators to patients, who would sit inside the dark enclosed space for hours. But the controversy began with what the box was claimed to do. Reich and his followers claimed that sitting inside the accumulator charged the human body with immense biological energy. The claims soon expanded into dangerous medical territory. It was rumored that regular use of the box could cure severe ailments, ranging from impotence to late-stage cancer. Patients reported feeling intense heat, tingling sensations, and a profound sense of well-being while inside. But when we look for the physical evidence of this cosmic energy, the science hits a boundary. The missing evidence in the Reich file is any independent empirical detection of the Orgone particle or wave. Investigators from the Food and Drug Administration examined the accumulators and concluded they were entirely medically useless. The most ordinary explanation is that the box simply acted as a mild thermal insulator, a rigid blanket that trapped the user's body heat, creating a physical sensation that patients, driven by the power of placebo, interpreted as healing energy. Believing Reich was a fraud preying on the desperately ill, the FDA secured a sweeping injunction against him. When Reich defied the court, he was arrested. He would later die in a federal penitentiary. This is where the story shifts from a dispute over medical claims into a lasting paranoid legend. The FDA did not merely ban the sale of the device. They physically destroyed the remaining accumulators with axes and ordered the burning of Reich's books, research papers, and promotional materials. For decades after, an enduring myth grew in the shadows: the belief that the FDA suppressed a working cure for cancer. The mystery survives not because the machine was proven to work, but because the government reacted with such aggressive, theatrical violence to shut it down. The story of the Orgone accumulator is not about whether the machine worked. It is about what happens when the state tries to erase an idea. We may never find scientific proof of Orgone energy, but Reich's tragedy proved something else entirely. When you burn a man's books and smash his machines, you don't destroy his theory. You guarantee that the myth will outlive the man. The PEAR reg. Hundreds of plastic spheres are falling. They cascade down a massive mechanical pegboard, bouncing chaotically off a maze of pins, slowly piling up at the bottom in a perfectly symmetrical bell curve. In front of the machine sits a person, perfectly still, staring intensely at the falling spheres. They are not touching the glass. They are not pressing any buttons. They are simply thinking. They are trying, through sheer mental willpower, to force the cascading spheres to fall just slightly more to the right. This sounds like a scene from a science fiction film, but it was a strictly documented academic study, and it took place in a basement laboratory at one of the most prestigious universities in the world. This was the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Program, known as PEAR, and the devices they built were random event generators. Founded in 1979 by Robert John, the former dean of engineering at Princeton, the PEAR lab operated continuously for 27 years. Its goal was to study whether human consciousness could interact with physical machinery. To do this, they removed all mysticism and relied purely on statistics. The lab utilized two main types of machines. The first was the mechanical cascade, affectionately known as the Murphy machine. The anatomy of this device was immense. A wall-mounted, glass-faced box dropping 9,000 polystyrene spheres through 336 nylon pegs. The second type of random event generator, or REG, was a microelectronic coin flipper. This was a small box generating a rapid, continuous stream of random zeros and ones based on electronic white noise. By design, these machines were mathematically bound to randomness. Over time, the results would always average out to a clean 50-50 split. The documented process was incredibly tedious. Ordinary volunteers, called operators, were brought into the lab. The instructions were simple. Sit in front of the machine and intend for it to produce more ones than zeros, or intend for the mechanical spheres to fall to the right, and then intend for the opposite. The lab recorded millions upon millions of trials, and the data they published was deeply unsettling. According to PEAR's extensive logs, when operators simply watched the machines without intention, the results were perfectly normal. But when they actively focused their minds on a specific outcome, the data showed a microscopic but statistically significant deviation from randomness. It was an incredibly tiny shift, roughly 2 to 3 parts per 10,000. But spread across millions of trials, it formed a mathematical anomaly that, according to standard physics, simply should not have existed. The core claim of the lab was staggering. PEAR suggested that the human mind could exert a microscopic pressure on physical reality. Over time, the legend expanded well beyond the basement. Researchers eventually launched the Global Consciousness Project, setting up REGs around the world to test if massive, emotionally charged global events, like natural disasters or profound tragedies, could cause sudden spikes in the random data, as if humanity shared a collective, measurable mental field. But as with all extraordinary claims, there is a boundary. The missing evidence in the PEAR file is flawless, undisputed replication by outside skeptics. When independent laboratories attempted to recreate the exact statistical significance of the Princeton experiments, they largely failed to capture the anomaly. The most ordinary explanation is that subtle, imperceptible flaws in the random number generators, combined with subconscious data mining and selective interpretation, created the illusion of an effect. Skeptics pointed out that a microscopic bias in the machine's wiring or environmental temperature could easily account for a deviation of 2 parts per 10,000. The most mysterious interpretation, fiercely defended by the lab until its closure, was that the machines worked perfectly, and that human intention inherently carries a minute quantum weight. The PEAR lab finally closed its doors in 2007. The project survives in memory because it wasn't a fringe experiment built by amateur ghost hunters. It was Ivy League engineering. It was the ultimate clash between the rigid laws of machinery and the unseen weight of human intention. Could a single thought be heavy enough to move a machine? The university eventually unplugged the devices, but the decades of anomalous data remain an irritating ghost in the machine of modern physics, refusing to be easily erased. The God Helmet. A person sits alone in a pitch-black, soundproof acoustic chamber. They are blindfolded. On their head rests a heavily modified, bright yellow snowmobile helmet, covered in strips of tape and trailing a thick bundle of wires to a computer monitor in the next room. For 20 minutes, there is only heavy silence, and then the subject begins to weep. They report a sudden, overwhelming sensation that they are no longer alone. Someone, or something, is standing right beside them in the dark. This device was known as the God Helmet. Developed in the 1980s by neuroscientist Dr. Michael Persinger and inventor Stanley Coren at Laurentian University, it was a machine built to hack the spiritual architecture of the human brain. The anatomy of the device was deceptively clinical, almost homemade in appearance. The yellow helmet was outfitted with a series of magnetic coils, or solenoids, positioned precisely over the subject's temporal lobes. The machine did not electrocute the subject. Instead, it generated complex but extremely weak magnetic fields, no stronger than the field emitted by a standard computer monitor or a hairdryer. The subject was placed into total sensory deprivation, and the magnetic signals were pulsed silently into their brain. According to Persinger's documented research, the results were astonishing. A significant number of subjects reported feeling a profound, invisible presence in the room. Depending on the subject's own beliefs and psychological state, this presence was interpreted in vastly different ways. Some felt intense, primal fear, describing a malicious entity watching them from the corner. Others felt a deep, transcendent peace, claiming they had been visited by angels, deceased relatives, or the divine presence of God. Persinger theorized that the complex magnetic fields temporarily disabled the brain's ego boundary, the delicate neurological mechanism that separates self from the outside world. By mildly disrupting the temporal lobes, the brain's left hemisphere suddenly interpreted the latent activity of its own right hemisphere as a completely separate, external entity. The helmet, Persinger claimed, was a mechanical switch for the supernatural. It sparked a massive philosophical firestorm. Skeptics argued the helmet proved that all religious awakenings, visions, and ghost sightings throughout history were merely localized magnetic glitches in the brain. Meanwhile, those leaning into the paranormal offered a completely different legend. They claimed the device wasn't creating a hallucination, but rather tuning the brain like an antenna, allowing it to perceive real spirits that were already hovering in the room. But the boundary of the mystery lies in the laboratory protocols. The missing evidence in the God helmet file is consistent, independent, double-blind replication. When skeptical researchers, like psychologist Richard Wiseman, attempted to recreate the experiment using strict double-blind methods, where neither the subject nor the researcher knew if the machine was actually turned on, the success rate plummeted. Critics pointed out that the helmet's magnetic fields were simply too weak to penetrate the human skull in any meaningful way. The most ordinary explanation is the sheer, overwhelming power of the placebo effect. If you place an anxious person in a terrifyingly quiet, pitch-black chamber, strap a strange machine to their skull, and suggest they might experience something profound, the brain's own expectations will do the rest. The sensory deprivation alone is enough to trigger powerful hallucinations. Yet, the God helmet remains one of the most provocative experiments in modern psychology. If a machine can make you feel God, does that mean the divine is just a magnetic glitch? Even if the device was ultimately just a high-tech placebo, the mystery of the helmet survives because of what it revealed about human nature. It proved that whether guided by solenoids, suggestibility, or simply the isolating silence of a dark room, the human brain is beautifully, terrifyingly wired to invent a companion when left entirely alone. The Dream Machine. You are sitting in a room, and your eyes are completely closed. But instead of darkness, your vision is suddenly flooded with violent, brilliant explosions of color. Kaleidoscopic patterns bloom across your eyelids. Elaborate geometric grids shift and rotate in perfectly symmetrical shapes, dissolving into sprawling landscapes, swirling vortexes, and shifting faces. You are wide awake. You have taken no chemicals, and your eyes remain shut tight. You are sitting in front of the Dream Machine. Created in 1959 by the artist Brian Gysin and the mathematician Ian Somerville, the Dream Machine is perhaps the most unlikely piece of mind-altering technology ever constructed. It was built during the height of the Beat generation, born from a desire to merge visionary art with mechanical engineering. The anatomy of the device is incredibly, almost absurdly simple. It consists of a tall cardboard or metal cylinder, pierced by a precise arrangement of jagged geometric cutouts. Inside the center of the cylinder hangs a single, bright, incandescent light bulb. The cylinder is placed onto the turntable of a standard phonograph record player and set to spin at exactly 78 revolutions per minute. When a user sits inches from the spinning cylinder and closes their eyes, the cutouts create a steady strobe effect. The light pulses through the closed eyelids at a highly specific rate, between 8 and 13 flashes per second. This number is not arbitrary. The documented grounding of the machine relies on a very real neurological phenomenon. The 8 to 13 Hz frequency perfectly matches the alpha waves of the human brain, the electrical rhythm of a mind in a relaxed, wakeful state. The physiological reaction is undeniable. Known in clinical neurology as photic stimulation, the rapid rhythmic pulsing of light essentially overloads the optic nerve, forcing the visual cortex into a state of intense, hyperactive synchronization. For Geisen, this was not just a clever optical illusion. He claimed the Dream Machine was a revolutionary new medium, the first and only work of art in the world designed to be viewed with your eyes closed. The legend of the machine spread rapidly through the underground. Prominent writers and thinkers claimed it unlocked hidden layers of consciousness, providing genuine spiritual awakening and access to deep psychological states, completely bypassing the need for hallucinogenic drugs. Geisen's ultimate utopian claim was that the Dream Machine would eventually replace television. He believed that, instead of passively absorbing external broadcasts, humanity would sit around glowing cylinders and watch the epic cinematic productions of their own minds. But as a piece of technology, it has a profound, uncrossable boundary. The missing evidence of the Dream Machine is an objective output. There is no way to record, share, or verify what the user actually sees. If 10 people sit around the same spinning cylinder, they will watch 10 entirely different movies. The art cannot be captured on film, exported to a hard drive, or mapped onto a screen. It remains trapped entirely within the subjective isolation of the individual viewer. The most ordinary explanation for the intense hallucinations is neurological confusion. The rapid strobe disrupts the visual cortex, and the brain, which acts as a relentless pattern recognition engine, begins generating wild, shifting geometry to try and make sense of the overwhelming optical noise. The brain is essentially hallucinating in an attempt to organize the static. But the more mysterious interpretation, held by those who champion the device, is that the flickering light bypasses our waking filters, illuminating the raw, underlying code of human perception. Anyone can build the machine. Geisen's original blueprints remain free and widely available. And if you build it, it will unequivocally work. But it leaves behind a lingering hypnotic question. When you close your eyes and the geometry begins to spin, where do the visions actually come from? Are they just the frantic static of a confused optic nerve? Or is the machine simply the projector, and the true screen is the inside of your own skull? The isolation tank. A heavy door pulls shut, extinguishing the last sliver of light. You are lying on your back in 10 inches of water, perfectly heated to the exact temperature of human skin. Because the water is saturated with hundreds of pounds of Epsom salt, you cannot sink. You float effortlessly in pitch-black, soundproof nothingness. Very quickly, the boundary where your body ends and the water begins completely disappears. There is no light. There is no sound. There is no gravity. This is the sensory deprivation tank. It is a machine designed with one highly specific goal: to completely remove the outside world. The tank was not originally built for spas or relaxation. It was forged in the clinical laboratories of the National Institute of Mental Health. In 1954, neurophysiologist Dr. John C. Lilly constructed the first isolation tanks to answer a fundamental scientific question. If you sever the human brain from all external physical stimuli, what happens to consciousness? Mainstream neurology at the time hypothesized that the brain, deprived of input, would simply power down and fall asleep. The physical anatomy of the early machines was incredibly claustrophobic. Lilly's initial prototypes were towering vertical cylinders filled with dark water, requiring the subject to be submerged while wearing a terrifying, full-head breathing mask. The design eventually evolved into the horizontal, pod-like tanks used today. But the documented science quickly revealed something profound. When Lilly placed subjects into the void, their brains did not go to sleep. Deprived of reality, the mind panicked and began to manufacture its own. Subjects in the tank experienced intense audio-visual hallucinations. Without incoming data from the optic nerve or the ears, the brain's internal prediction engine simply started feeding on itself, dredging up vivid memories, shifting colors, and disembodied voices to fill the terrifying silence. This is where the documented science ends, and the legend of John C. Lilly begins its dark descent. Lilly became obsessed with the machine. Over the years, he moved his research from government labs to a private facility in the Virgin Islands. He claimed that the tank was not merely creating hallucinations, but acting as a portal. According to his later writings, in the absolute depths of isolation, Lilly allegedly made contact with a vast, invisible network of cosmic entities. He called them the Earth Coincidence Control Office, or ECCO, claiming they were interdimensional beings guiding human evolution. But the missing evidence in the isolation tank file is objective reality. As Lilly pushed the boundaries of his research, he began injecting high doses of psychedelics, primarily LSD and ketamine, before stepping into the pitch-black water. His pure scientific method shattered, entirely compromising the data. There was no way to prove whether Lilly had actually tuned into an extraterrestrial network, or if he was simply drowning in the chemical chaos of his own isolated mind. The most ordinary explanation is that the human brain cannot handle a vacuum. When you strip away the world, it builds a new one out of memories, fears, and chemical noise. The most mysterious interpretation, one that Lilly championed until his death, is that consciousness does not actually originate inside the skull. To Lilly, the brain was just a receiver, and the tank was a way to tune out the static of Earth to finally hear the transmissions of the cosmos. The sensory deprivation tank survived as a cultural icon, inspiring films like Altered States and spawning a modern wellness industry, because it represents the terrifying final frontier of inner space. It was a machine designed to turn off the outside world, but it ended up turning on something much darker inside. When you strip away every sound, sight, and feeling, what is left in the dark with you? The machine proved that the ultimate mystery isn't what lies beyond the stars. It proved that, left entirely alone, the self is an uncontrollable universe. The biophoton detector. Imagine a room engineered to be entirely devoid of light. Inside this pitch-black chamber, a scientist places a small, germinating seed. The room is so dark and the walls are so thick that a human observer standing inside would see absolutely nothing. But when the scientist activates a highly sensitive camera, the monitor reveals something breathtaking. The seed is glowing. It is pulsating with a faint, steady light. This is not a thermal image. It is not infrared. It is actual, visible light. In the 1970s, a German biophysicist named Fritz Albert Popp constructed a device that we might call the biophoton detector. He wanted to test a bizarre hypothesis about living tissue, and to do so, he needed an environment of absolute darkness. The anatomy of the device was built around a massive light-proof box. Inside the chamber, Popp installed a photomultiplier tube, a highly advanced instrument usually reserved for astronomy or particle physics. It was a sensor so incredibly sensitive that it could detect the emission of a single, solitary photon in a completely dark room. When Popp placed biological specimens inside the machine, he made a staggering, meticulously documented discovery. It wasn't just the seed. Every living thing he tested, leaves, insects, animal tissue, and eventually human DNA, was actively emitting ultra-weak photons. The science of this phenomenon is completely confirmed. Hidden beneath the threshold of human vision, every living thing on Earth is softly glowing. The machine also revealed that this light was not static. The intensity of the glow changed depending on the health and stress of the organism. When a cell was injured, infected, or exposed to toxins, the photomultiplier recorded a sudden flare of light, as if the cell was bleeding energy. As the tissue died, the light would flash brilliantly and then fade away into total darkness. But this is where the physical reality of the machine ends, and a decades-long theoretical battle begins. Pop did not believe this light was just a biological accident. He claimed that these photons acted as a highly complex, intelligent communication network. According to his theory, cells were using these flashes of light to talk to one another across the body, transmitting biological data faster than any chemical signal ever could. In fringe and alternative communities, this claim exploded into legend. Many argued that the biophoton detector was the ultimate scientific validation of the human aura. They claimed it was the literal, physical manifestation of the glowing life force that earlier devices, like the Kirlian Camera, had only hinted at. The machine was hailed as the bridge between quantum physics and ancient mysticism. But there is a firm boundary to this mystery. The missing evidence in the biophoton file is any definitive, undisputed proof that the cells are actually using the light to communicate. Mainstream biology pushes back heavily against Pop's grand theories. The most ordinary explanation is that biophotons are simply metabolic exhaust. When cells undergo oxidative stress and normal chemical reactions, they naturally release trace amounts of energy in the form of light, much like a car engine naturally radiates heat. It is a byproduct, not a language. The most mysterious interpretation, however, is that this light forms a coherent quantum field, an energetic blueprint that orchestrates human biology in ways we do not yet have the instruments to understand. Science has not proven that our souls are made of light, or that our bodies engage in glowing cellular telepathy. But the mystery survives because it takes a beautiful, poetic myth and grounds it in undeniable physics. We cannot see it when we look in the mirror, but the machine proved that human beings are literally bioluminescent. The only question left is whether this light is just the exhaust of biology or the language of life itself. The Dream Decoder. You are asleep, but you are not in a quiet bedroom. You are lying deep inside the claustrophobic tunnel of a massive magnetic resonance imaging machine. You are dreaming. In your mind, you see a person, a car, a building, but you are not the only one seeing it. In the observation room next door, a group of scientists is watching a computer monitor. Slowly, out of a haze of digital static, blurry, ghostly pixels begin to shift and coalesce. The screen is rendering a crude, shifting image of the exact object you are dreaming about. This is the Dream Decoder. It sounds like a paranoid science fiction film, but it is a strictly documented reality. In 2013, researchers at the ATR Computational Neuroscience Laboratories in Japan published a groundbreaking study in the journal Science. They had successfully built a system capable of decoding visual imagery during human sleep. The anatomy of the device merges sterile medical hardware with artificial intelligence. It utilizes a standard fMRI scanner, a massive tube designed to track the subtle fluctuations of blood flow within the brain. By focusing on the visual cortex, the machine maps the exact pattern of oxygenated blood that surges when the mind registers specific shapes. But the true architecture of the Dream Decoder lies in the computer in the next room. A machine learning algorithm trains to act as a translator between biological tissue and digital pixels. The documented procedure was grueling. Researchers first placed awake subjects into the scanner and showed them hundreds of images from various categories. The machine painstakingly recorded the unique blood flow signature for each object. Then the subjects were told to go to sleep inside the thrumming tube. During the early stages of sleep, The machine continued to read their visual cortex. The subjects were repeatedly woken up and asked what they had just seen. The results were chilling. The algorithm was able to look at the brain scans of the sleeping subjects and predict the categories of the objects they were dreaming about with roughly 60% accuracy. The machine could tell if the dreamer was looking at a human or a building long before the dreamer opened their eyes to speak. When the study was released, the claims surrounding the technology immediately exploded. Media outlets declared that the ultimate mind-reading machine had arrived. The public imagined a near-future device that functioned as a direct video recorder for human thought, capable of exporting high-definition movies of our deepest dreams and private memories. Rumors circulated about dystopian implications, governments scanning the subconscious, corporations extracting secrets from sleeping minds, and the total collapse of cognitive privacy. But there is a strict boundary between the biological reality and the dystopian myth. The missing evidence in the story of the dream decoder is the ability to decode complex, flowing narratives. The machine does not literally record a video feed of the mind. It cannot see the emotional context of a nightmare or the bizarre logic of deep REM sleep. The ordinary explanation is that it simply identifies broad categories of data that it has already been taught to recognize. It is advanced pattern matching, not telepathy. The more mysterious interpretation, however, is what the machine represents. It suggests that the boundary between biological consciousness and digital reality is entirely permeable. It proved that human imagination leaves a physical footprint, one that can be tracked, measured, and reconstructed by an unfeeling algorithm. The dream decoder survives in our collective anxiety because it is a device that crosses the final frontier of human privacy, peering into the one place that was always safe from the waking world. For all of human history, a dream was a secret between you and the dark. It was the only room in the universe where you were guaranteed to be completely alone. Now, the machines are watching, and as the algorithms grow sharper, it leaves us with a terrifying, unresolved question. If a machine can see your dreams, who owns the rights to your subconscious? Walk through the history of these devices and you are left with a room full of silent machinery, wires leading nowhere, heavy iron scales resting at zero, wooden boxes rotting in the archives, and glass photographic plates holding nothing but dust. From the heavy Victorian beds meant to weigh a departing soul, to the stacked oscillators searching for a ghost in the static, right up to the cold magnetic tubes trying to read our dreams. These machines were built from ordinary things: copper, glass, wood, and code. But they were all constructed to answer the exact same question: is there something more? We trust machines because they do not lie. They are objective. They give us numbers, weights, voltages, and frequencies. We built these devices hoping they could finally drag the supernatural out of the shadows and force it onto a measurable ledger. We wanted proof that the soul had mass, that consciousness could move physical objects, that life was made of light, and that the dead were only a phone call away. But the unseen world refuses to be so easily documented. The phantom leaf fades when the glass is wiped clean. The ghosts on the tape dissolve into radio interference. The 21 grams evaporate into thermal biology. Yet, when we look back at these forgotten machines, they do not feel like failures. Even when the science is debunked and the extraordinary claims are dismantled, the mystery surrounding them survives. They survive because they perfectly map the shape of human longing. They may not have proved the existence of the supernatural, but they proved the relentless, desperate weight of human imagination. They tell us that no matter how advanced our technology becomes, or how cold and clinical our laboratories get, we are still just looking out into the absolute dark, and we will build anything to try and turn on the light.